Okay, folks, we'll make a start. First of all, as you can see, there are a wee bit more bodies have turned up than we had thought might, so apologies for the rather close-knit,
intimate
nature of the
You stop looking at me like that,
Mrs. I'll just remind you, this is being live streamed on the internet, but that's fine. That's fine. Well, listen. First of all, thanks to everybody for coming. I realised we'd arranged this at extremely short notice. Alan and I had been trying to find something for most of the last year, basically, and it just so happened that our diaries matched, so we thought better this than nothing. I also thought it was important that we try to do a meeting of this nature before we vote on the bill, which is expected to be around about the 11th of December. So that's why it's been so quickly organised. But thanks to each of you for turning up. Now, obviously, there's been quite a bit of drama happening this week, to put it one way. And I hope not to get too bogged down on the political drama, because there are actually pretty serious issues at stake. Although I'm always happy maybe to do that in the pub afterwards. So I won't talk for too long because you can see me anytime. I'm going to hand over to Alan just to give a kind of overview as to where he thinks things stand. Also, what he thinks of the withdrawal agreement, which is here. 585 pages of wishful thinking, guff. It will make a good kind of door opener, I suppose, a door stopper. And also for Alan to give us a sense of how things are going in Brussels and amongst our friends across the European Union. Crucially, what does this mean for us in terms of the next steps to build the case for independence, and also a chance for you to ask any questions you want to ask as well. So I'll hand over to Alan to get the show on the road. Alan.
Stuart. Thank you, and thanks to Cathcart and Stuart for the invitation. Thank you all for coming along as well. Great to see so many familiar faces, and glad we're here to talk about what is the biggest political issue of the day. And it's going to be the biggest political issue of the foreseeable future. Sorry about that. So I was coming here and actually I bumped into Tommy Cooper, which was remarkable because he's been dead a number of years. I would be a Glasgow, there's always one. And he said, Alan, I'm going to cut off the bottom of your trouser legs. I'm going to take them to a library. I said, that's a turn up for the books.
Thanks for your time, folks.
Good session. And I'm afraid that's the only laugh you're getting out of me this morning, which was the actual punchline. The last couple of years have been tough. I'm getting emails on a daily basis that would break your heart. People who are feeling anxious for their future, people who have made life decisions about where their job is, where they're living, who their partners are, where their kids are going to school, on the basis that they have rights. And those rights are being taken away. And as that gets closer and closer into view, people are feeling more and more anxious and nervous. So if you take nothing else away today, if you know any EU nationals living in Scotland, remember, if you're here, you're one of us. If you're Scottish, if you're here, you're part of our community, you have a stake in our future, you're here, you're welcome, you're valued. Because a lot of people are feeling anxious, myself included. So I'll tell you, and I don't propose to do grand speechifying today, a tale of two referendums, to just contextualise how we got to where we are, this remarkable place that we are. And in terms of the future, I rule absolutely nothing out, up to and including alien invasion. Though you look at Jacob Rees-Mogg and maybe the body snatchers are already here, who knows? But what we must have is seriousness. And I am very proud to be part of an SNP team that has been serious throughout this process. We have been at our posts, we have been working hard, we've been led by a First Minister who has been the epitome of professionalism. The amount of European colleagues that are speaking to me saying, well, it looks like the Scots are the only grown-ups in the room on Crazy Island, because that's increasingly how the UK is being perceived. The UK was not hated across the European Union. The UK was taken seriously. You speak to some of the Brexiters and you'd think it was always 27 versus 1, the UK was always fighting away and losing all the votes. No, the UK was well respected, well liked. Now, I'm a proud nationalist for Scotland, but the Brits had a good reputation for being serious, pragmatic, not ideological. That reputation has been trashed by the last couple of years, as we have had a gratuitously offensive debate within these islands, in English, and they can all read it. We're EU nationals who are simultaneously referred to as work-shy scroungers, but are also here stealing all the jobs. We are looking dreadful in the eyes of our European friends and colleagues, and there's going to be consequences to this for us in Scotland as well. We cannot pretend we're immune to this. So the tale of two referendums. Cast your minds back to the independence referendum of 2014. We had votes at 16, because that's progressive. We had EU nationals had a right to vote, because if you're here, you're one of us. Where you're from is an interesting part of your own story, but if you're here, you're part of our community now and into the future. So EU nationals were able to vote, and some voted yes, some voted no. That's democracy. We also had a prospectus. We had a 650-page prospectus of what an independent Scotland was going to look like, so that people could kick the tyres of it, people could test how it was going to be, and some people were persuaded, some people were not. That's democracy. But there was a prospectus that people could actually analyse, so we had an energising debate about possibilities. It's which currency will we have? What will our trading arrangements be? What will we do about climate change? Contrast that with the EU referendum a number of years later, where, remember, a lot of people in the independence referendum were told, vote no to secure your European Union membership. We're a partnership of equals. Lead, not leave. All of those promises. And barely a couple of years later, we're brought to the EU referendum, which Mr Cameron brought forward in order to heal the divisions within his own party. Cracking job, Chief, that's going well. For an entirely domestic, internal Tory party dispute, he brought forward a referendum as a quick fix to get himself out of trouble for a wee while. And our guys at Westminster, and we know something about referendums by this point, said this is a dangerous game. You need to, as the legislation for the referendum was going through, we put forward a number of amendments, but three main ones. We proposed votes at 16 to bring young people into the franchise. We proposed that EU nationals resident in the UK, around about 2.8 million people, should have the right to vote in the EU referendum. We also proposed a double majority across the 4 home nations, in that for a referendum to be valid successfully, it would need to have a majority of votes across the UK, as well as a majority within each of the 4 home nations of Northern Ireland, Scotland, England and Wales. All 3 of these suggestions were arrogantly, contemptuously dismissed by a Conservative administration that said, just leave this to us, jocks, we know what we're doing. Any one of those measures individually would have changed the result. Had 16, 17-year-olds been able to vote, they would have voted overwhelmingly to remain. Had EU nationals been able to vote, pretty confident they would have voted overwhelmingly to remain. Had there been a double majority across the 4 home nations, Northern Ireland and Scotland voting remain would have nullified the result and brought us back to a further discussion without the time pressure. So we've been the grown-ups. Throughout this process we have opposed the idea that an EU referendum was necessary. We put forward ways to make it better, and they were dismissed by an arrogant and incompetent Conservative administration. And then Mr Cameron walked away, which is why I really hope he doesn't sleep at night. I'm not a vindictive person, but I really hope he doesn't sleep at night for what he's done. And Mrs May, to be fair to her, and I will do my best to be fair to her, I think she's tried to find solutions. I think she's tried to find an answer. Her mistake, and if you're ever feeling sorry for Mrs May at the moment, and even I've wavered a wee bit in the last couple of days, but if you're ever feeling sorry for her, remember that she is the mistress of her own misfortune. Every single decision that she has made has resulted in the problems we now have. Had she said, when she was standing for the Conservative leadership against Andrea Leadsom, that Brexit means staying in the single market, staying in the customs union, and I'll start negotiations for that. Once we've had a year's discussion, and then we'll trigger Article 50 once we know what we want. She would have won, and she would have had a plan. The ultra-Brexiteers wouldn't have voted for her, but they would have had that discussion then. Because she chose to fudge it, because she chose to say things like Brexit means Brexit. Now, she's an intelligent woman. But Brexit means nothing. Brexit means whatever you want, I'll deliver. So she made these promises and she's kept that fudge going, and we're now at the point where the fudge breaks down. Because sadly she has delivered a deal, all 556 pages of it, and I've had to read it. And she's delivered a deal that doesn't deliver on leaves promises, and it doesn't deliver on Remain either. So I suspect that this document is not going to go much further. Stuart's in a better position than me to predict how it might go at Westminster, but my problem with the entire agreement is that it's being presented as a false choice. The Article 50 process, to explain it. Article 50 is a dreadful piece of legislation. The people who wrote it admit this now. It was never designed to be used. It was there as a safety, as a fire extinguisher that's there to reassure you, but you never want to actually use it. It was designed that no serious administration would trigger Article 50. Because Article 50 starts a 2-year time-limited period whereby we must find an agreement to the exit provisions of the member states and then the future relationship. And because the negotiations have been as tortuous as they've been, because the UK has not engaged with them, we're now at the stage where the exit agreement, and don't call it the deal, call it the exit agreement, because that's all it deals with. The exit agreement deals with 3 main aspects. It's the settling of our debts, the settling of our bills, it's EU citizens' rights in terms of UK nationals who are resident across the European Union, EU nationals who are resident here. So people have done that on rights, and there's a degree of those rights are going to be continued. So that's set out in the document. And it also deals with Northern Ireland. Now, we're Scots, we're in Glasgow, we know that Northern Ireland is in a really serious situation. I'm back and forth to Belfast regularly to go and meet colleagues over there, studiously neutral in terms of their own constitutional future, but utterly supportive of a peace process that is really fragile. Now, within Northern Ireland, and I'll meet Sinn Féin, I'll meet the DUP, I'll meet all parties in between, they're all saying the same thing. It's anybody under the age of 21, 22 doesn't remember the bad times. But they've been hearing from the old stagers how glamorous and exciting it was. So they don't remember the bad times, but they're hankering for something else. There's also, across the border right now, a smuggling infrastructure, which is making money out of this right now. Now, it's low-level stuff. It's euro to sterling arbitrage, it's green diesel, red diesel, cigarettes, that sort of stuff. But there is a smuggling infrastructure good to go right now. There are bad men, and they are, by and large are all bad men, making their living out of this right now. Anything that changes that border will be taken advantage of immediately. And the undermining of the peace process in Northern Ireland is the most grievous aspect of the whole Brexit business. Because remember the referendum? Where was Northern Ireland in the discussions? Nowhere. It wasn't taken seriously because they didn't think they were going to win. And they didn't have a prospectus. And anything that undermines the Good Friday Agreement is deeply dangerous. And the Good Friday Agreement, remember, was endorsed in a referendum north and south of the island of Ireland by a massive majority. So when the Brexiters are talking about the will of the people, they're talking about the will of some of the people. They're disrespecting the Good Friday Agreement, which is an international treaty with Dublin, and they're undermining it, and that's undermining a peace process which is grievously dangerous. So in terms of the exit agreement, it now exists. It's pretty much signed off by the European side. Michel Barnier, on behalf of the 27 member states, has stuck closely to his mandate, and it now exists. And I'm afraid, like the Chequers plan and like Mr Cameron's plan, I don't think we're going to need to pay much more attention to it, because I suspect it's not going to be approved by the Westminster Parliament. Which leaves us with, again, the false choice of deal versus no deal, the Noel Edmonds question. It's coming down to this absurd idea that either you accept my deal or it's chaos. And it's rare I agree with anybody whose surname is Johnson. But Joe Johnson, who seems to be the better brother, I have to say, I think actually hit the nail on the head when he resigned, saying that the choice of vassalage or chaos is an utterly false choice. The biggest failure of UK statecraft since Suez, actually I think it's bigger than that. It's an utterly false choice. And the idea that no deal is a serious prospect. Now, no deal, to explain it. Under Article 50, if you're buying a car and you walk away from the deal because it's a bad deal. You don't have a car, but you don't have any other problems. This is not that. Under Article 50, EU laws cease to apply. The treaties cease to apply to the UK at the expiration of the Article 50 period. So unless the laws are somehow rolled over, unless there is a transition agreed within the exit agreement, then the laws stop. That is unconscionable, which is why I don't think it's a serious prospect, but we need to take it very seriously as a risk. But in terms of the exit agreement, the significant point is that if it is approved, there is a transition period for 21 months or so, whereby the laws roll forward. But it's a false choice, because it's not actually going to tell us anything about the future relationship. If you're going to change how we live our lives, you need to have a decent idea of what the change is going to be, and that was my point about the prospectus that we had in the independence referendum. There was an absolute lack of a prospectus within the Leave campaign. Brexit means anything you want it to mean. Brexit was all the stuff you like you'll keep, and you'll be able to get rid of all the stuff you don't like. Vote for Brexit and everything that's wrong with your life will be made better, and £350 million a week for the NHS. Who wouldn't vote for that? And people voted Leave, decent, thoughtful people voted Leave on the basis of promises from people they took seriously and were entitled to take seriously. The fact that they've been shown up to be either hopelessly naive and unrealistic or downright shysters is the problem that we now have. So in terms of whether or not a transition period is agreed, I think that can be spun out from this exit agreement. I think this exit agreement is not fit for purpose. I've said it's a fudge that doesn't serve anybody's interests. It certainly doesn't serve Scotland's interests. And I'm quite confident our guys are going to vote against it, quite rightly. Whether or not the arithmetic within the House of Commons is going to see to a full rejection remains to be seen. We don't know, bluntly, at the moment. But I don't think this is fit for purpose. The key point for us is making sure that there is a transition. But it's not going to be no deal. No deal is unconscionable. And if this is rejected, it's not this deal or chaos. The EU will then regroup and we'll keep talking. So from our side, we have a number of challenges ahead of us, but the facts are out there. We've put together, long since, I've got 3 copies here to give away, but we've got Scotland and Europe. People say that the EU is complicated and difficult. Well, how does Glasgow City Council pass its budget? How do you amend legislation anywhere? We've managed to summarise all of it into a pretty user-friendly book, because I am absolutely adamant that the European question is going to be the defining attribute of UK politics and Scottish politics for the years to come. I believe the European question is actually going to deliver Scotland's independence. Now that will be a democratic discussion, which we will have openly and transparently with the people of Scotland. And at the moment, there are questions to that independence proposition which are as yet unclear because of the chaos that the UK finds itself in. So we're not going to rush a process that we do not control, but we are going to be at our posts, working hard across the Holyrood, Westminster and European Parliaments, local government up and down Scotland, to make sure that we reassure the people of Scotland that we are serious people. We are at our posts, we have a challenge, but we will openly and transparently work hard to make that better. I'm producing, if you're not getting my weekly update every Friday, seriously, not many jokes in it, but we are getting the facts out there so that people can see outside of the media what's actually going on. Because my job is to inform the discussion, inform the debate. None of us have the monopoly on wisdom in this. And it's going to take all the talents to fix it. We need to reach out to people of all politics and none to try and fix this, because Scotland is looking on at this in horror as a broken Westminster delivers chaos. And my concern is that, a terrible comparison, but my concern is that some of the attitudes I'm seeing from some of the Conservative politicians remind me of the First World War generals. Midway through the First World War, when everybody knew it was hopeless and pointless, but it was easier to just keep going than to call a halt and say this is madness. And I fear that's where some of the Conservatives are, and we need to shake them out of that, for their own good and ours. So we've got a common endeavour. I look forward very much to your questions and comments. You be frank with me and I'll be frank with you, and we'll try and fix this together. Thanks very much.
Okay, Alan, thanks very much for that opening. We'll move to, I'm sure all of you have got something to ask, something to say or something to check, so I'll try and get through as many.
If anybody's got a solution, actually, do chip in, that'd be great.
Save it all and step forward now.
Exactly.
We'll try and get as many folk in as possible, so please do keep your questions, comments short. I'm going to kick off the discussion with one point, which was actually a point, Alan, that you opened on. I'd like you to kind of illustrate a bit further. 2 weeks ago, when I was at a conference in Ukraine, it was filled with delegates from embassies from countries all over the world, mostly European Union countries. And I was the only UK politician there. There were lots of people who were civil servants in the British government there. And the big thing that came across to me, a bit like you were saying, was that, and I perhaps didn't appreciate this fully before, that the British side in any big international grouping could always be relied upon to be the adults in the room. They could knock heads together, but there seems to be a realisation that it's gone, and that the influence, if you like, is ceding quite rapidly. But above all of that, it came across that Brexit just is not the dominating issue in European countries around the world. Au contraire, they are not obsessed with this in the way that sometimes people in this country can think we are. Certainly this idea of Volkswagen was going to come running to our rescue and all the rest of it. I want you to talk a wee bit more about that. What has this done for the UK's reputation, and what does it mean going forward?
Absolutely.
Just another thing, if you raise hands, I'll start to know who wants to get in.
But absolutely. I mean, I'm proudly pro-independence for Scotland. I've been fighting for it in the European Parliament for 15 years now. But the UK did have a good reputation across our European friends. Was taken seriously. It was celebrated for not being too ideological, not being too French, not being too German. Often the Brits, largely on a linguistic basis, would be able to find the form of words that would get everybody united. And the UK won the vast majority of votes in Brussels. The idea that the EU was not working for the UK, the single market was Margaret Thatcher's creation. It was a Tory creation because the Tories wanted the EU to be all about economics rather than about culture or political identity. And what we've now got is a dreadful situation where the UK civil servants, and I've been doing this long enough that I know a lot of people in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, in the UK representation, at the Cabinet Office, wherever, who are trying to make a decent fist of it. But they're passing the memos up, they're passing the plans up to the ministers. Intellectual heavyweights like David Davis and the rest of them, and they're not even being read. And I've heard reports from various places within Brussels about ministerial meetings where the minister would turn up with clearly not an idea why he was there. And that's how you lose credibility. When I turn up to a meeting, I make sure I've got my brief, I've read it, the basic sort of stuff that you'd expect serious people to do. But that's not where the UK's been over the last couple of years, because everything has been about the internal politics of the Conservative Party. And what's going on with they wacky foreigners over in Brussels? Oh well, that's just a sideshow. That doesn't matter. What's the Daily Mail saying? Grossly disrespectful to how the EU does business. Now, the EU is an open and transparent organisation, 28 different member states with vastly different political traditions, vastly different ways of doing things. You've got to be. You've got to go through the gears. You've got to be open and transparent to make sure that Slovenia is on board and Slovakia is happy with the proposition and the Germans don't have any issues with what's being proposed. So we go through the gears on everything, and the UK has not engaged with that process. And there's real wider implications to it. I mean, there's a vote coming up on the Chagos Islands within the United Nations. The Chagos Islands, Diego Garcia, which were seized, and the Chagos Islands, the Chagosians were thrown off their lands a number of years ago and are fighting for compensation. And the UK government is likely to lose the vote because they've got Nepals. International diplomacy is not about sentiment, it's about interests. And the UK has thrown away its credibility to such an extent. And this is dangerous. This is dangerous for us as well. And what it has also shown, we're within the party sometimes, some people are a bit sceptical about independence in Europe. We want independence, but I'm not sure about that Europe thing, son. Yeah, that's out there, and I respect that. But how can we be against something we've never had? And if you want to see what independence in Europe looks like, look at how Ireland's been treated over the last couple of years. The way that the EU has respected and supported Dublin against the former imperial power has put Ireland in the driving seat for the first time in Ireland's history vis-à-vis the UK. Because 27 is a bigger number than 1 and solidarity matters. So that's what independence in Europe looks like. It's solidarity with the global A-team against a state that doesn't quite know where it fits in the world. So there's real consequences to this.
Okay, I'm going to try and take maybe 3 at a time. I'm going to start with yourself, sir, and I'll come to you, and if you just catch my eyes, things go on.
Mr. Smith, can you tell us what the other MEPs in Europe, what they're thinking about in terms of Scotland as a separate entity?
Yourself?
Mrs Merkel's already said that that document can't be renegotiated, but I saw on the BBC News today that there's a gang of 5 who are hoping to, quote, shift May on the plan.
Yeah.
I think it's in relation to Ireland, but do you have any insight into what they're trying to do?
And yourself in the red jacket.
And the advantageous position that Northern Ireland will now be in compared with Scotland should the backstop apply.
Okay, Alan, do you want to kick the ball on those 3? And if you just catch my eyes, Alan's talking, I'll make sure you get in.
On other MEPs, I've got an article in the National on Sunday, well tomorrow, Sunday, about precisely this, where it's the fact that in all 565 pages of that document, Scotland is not mentioned once, makes my blood boil. And actually, it could be perceived as a failure on our part, because despite the 2 years of work that we've put in, despite the Standing Council in Europe advising the First Minister, despite the blood, sweat and tears from our Westminster group, not a single mention of Scotland in that document. But the reason why Northern Ireland is mentioned, the reason why Cyprus is mentioned, the reason why Gibraltar is mentioned, all of them getting special status, is because a member state of the 27 has demanded it. And the UK was powerless to resist. So Dublin wanted a special status for Northern Ireland under the Good Friday Agreement. Cyprus wanted a special status for the sovereign bases on Cyprus. Gibraltar needed a special status and Spain demanded it. Because if you're in the 27, you can demand solidarity of our friends and colleagues, and the UK was powerless to resist. Because we are part of the UK, and David Mundell, not known for his insights, but David Mundell really did come up with the best phrase of the reality of how the Union works for Scotland right now. We are not a partner in the UK, we are part of the UK. And we have been represented in these talks by the UK government that doesn't give 2 hoots for Scotland. And I think that's not good enough for what we aspire to. It's also delivered an exit agreement that doesn't respect our interests and doesn't even mention us. This is the reality for people who were unconvinced about independence in 2014. This is the reality of the Union and how it works. You can see where we are as a result of the UK's negotiations. We're nowhere in that document. So other MEPs have a keen awareness of where Scotland is, where Scotland sits. Nobody is going to get into our internal business. And if anything, I've actually been calming people down from that. Because we've got a domestic discussion to have. And I want the decisions about Scotland to be made by the people who live in Scotland, not people from outside, however well-intentioned. And there is a strong appetite that if we could turn Brexit round for the whole of the UK, there's an appetite for that. Even at the last minute, I think, if there was a reversal, be that a referendum, be that a meaningful vote in the House of Commons, the EU side would say, okay, that was a rubbish 2 years, but all right, we'll reverse that. But in terms of attitudes to Scotland as an independent entity, yes, there's a keen awareness of where we're coming from. There is, if we get to the point where Brexit happens, and we're fighting tooth and nail to stop that, but I'm talking about the Brexit flip in terms of attitudes to Scotland the day and hour Brexit happens will change. Because the UK will not be a member state anymore, so we'll not be able to call on that solidarity. And we go from being, and there are still some other folks who view us as awkward, tricky. You know, the word nationalism in Brussels remains an issue that some people will, you know, let's be careful with that. There's an awful lot more people get us now than in 2014, because post-Brexit, if we get to there, we will be the pro-European good guys. And I am working on making sure we have the goodwill built up in the bank with our colleagues And I have to say, the way that we have engaged with this as serious, sensible, credible people has really helped with that. So there's a keen awareness of where we're coming from and a readiness to assist with whatever Scotland's future is if we make the right choices. In terms of the deal being renegotiated, you're right, this is going to be tough. There is zero appetite across the other 27 to renegotiate this exit agreement. So we're going to need to be pretty spiky in terms of, but this is rubbish, you know this is rubbish. The EU side knows full well that this is a bad deal for the UK. Of course it is, how could it be better? You can't leave a club and demand better terms. You can't enjoy the benefits of membership of a club but not be a member of the club. So whatever Mrs May delivered, and this is where, if it was Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister, if it was Boris Johnson Prime Minister, we'd still have come back with a rubbish deal, because we could only come back with a rubbish deal. That said, there is zero appetite amongst the EU 27 to renegotiate this and reopen this, because they just don't think, they think the UK is just playing games with it. With some justification, I have to say. But there's also a realpolitik that if this is rejected and it's not on the table anymore, the grown-ups will step in. And amongst MEPs, amongst members of the council, avoiding no-deal chaos will then become the priority. And how that will be done, and we're going to have a lot of sabre rattling from the EU 27 side that this is the only deal. Mrs May's done this is as good as it's going to get. That's not the case. And we're going to need to do a bit of brinkmanship on that, but we're going to need to ask ourselves the honest question, is this a good deal for us? No, it's not. And if it's not a good deal for us, why on earth are we accepting it? Mrs May has spent the last 2 years saying no deal is better than a bad deal, and now suddenly a bad deal is better than no deal. Now this is not serious. In terms of the situation in Northern Ireland, let's be really clear with ourselves about this. We utterly support the Good Friday Agreement. We utterly support the Northern Irish peace process. That necessitates a special status for Northern Ireland, and we don't grudge them it. But if there could be a special status for Northern Ireland and Cyprus and Gibraltar and various other territories within that document, had the UK put forward a differentiated solution for us that respects the UK's own internal constitutional order and political reality, because in a democratic vote we rejected Brexit, so had they played smart and tried to get Scotland a special status, it would have been looked at on its merits. They didn't. So the issue for us is absolutely, in the future, that could make Northern Ireland one of the most attractive places in the UK to do business, as part of the single market and customs union, but also part of the UK market. Now, how they're going to manage that remains still to be seen, but there could be a vastly, and if I was a DUP politician, I'd be thinking, happy days, this is the best possible result. But for their own ideological reasons, that's not where they are. But in terms of the economic advantages that Northern Ireland is going to have, it will be vast, and I don't begrudge them it. But if it's possible for Northern Ireland, it should have been possible for us as well. And that failure is where the Tories have let us down comprehensively.
And the weird bit is the DUP sit behind the part of the chamber that we sit in. And there you have them arguing against this for Northern Ireland, and us arguing for what Northern Ireland have got, but they won't give it to us. So it's all very strange. Could you just, Alan, before we take the next question, because I'm conscious there's a lot of jargon involved in this, could you do a quick explanation of what the backstop is? And I'm not making this bit up. What is the backstop to the backstop?
Yes, thank you. I'm
just to make sure you're awake, that's all.
Absolutely. I'm conscious that, yes, I can slip into jargon as well, so if get me to explain anything that's not clear. The backstop is, because of the phasing of the Article 50 talks, first the exit in the exit agreement, which is citizens' rights, the financial contribution, Northern Ireland, and then on to the future relationship, which is the trading arrangements, the customs union, the single market, freedom of movement, that sort of stuff. But in order to safeguard the Good Friday Agreement, it was banged right in at the start of the process, which said, in order to respect the Good Friday Agreement, which is predicated upon both parts of the island of Ireland being in the single market, the same as our independence proposition in 2014 was predicated upon the UK and us remaining within the customs union and the single market. So actually many of the nuts and bolts things wouldn't have changed. It would have been the democratic control and accountability that would have altered. But because the Good Friday Agreement was constructed on that basis, the UK agreed in December last year that that would be the case. So the backstop is, unless during the 21-month transition period a new solution can be found that will somehow magically keep Northern Ireland in two unions at once, then the backstop will apply and Northern Ireland will be a special status within the single market and customs union. The backstop to the backstop, this is where there's been too many journalists having too much fun just spouting nonsense about stuff. The backstop to the backstop idea is that if that can't be done, then that can be somehow redone by the UK. Which means that it's not a backstop. Because a backstop is what happens if you can't find another solution. So that is absolutely crucial. And that does, of course, mean that the single market is going to continue to apply to vast chunks of Northern Ireland's economy, which is a great thing for them, but it causes real problems for the UK. The Dutch civil service, very early on in the Brexit process, put a team of their crack civil servants into a darkened room for as long as they needed to try and fix the Northern Ireland problem. And they concluded it couldn't be fixed. They concluded that you cannot have UK, so Great Britain and Northern Ireland, outside of the customs union, but Northern Ireland, respecting the Good Friday Agreement, within. Now, Mrs May has to square that circle, we don't. But within this exit agreement, the backstop is absolutely front and centre of that. And the UK agreed to this as long ago as December. So then for the Conservatives to say that, well, the EU is being unreasonable, the EU is trying to punish us. No, you agreed to this best part of 12 months ago, and the EU is not unreasonable to expect you to make good at your promises. So that's the backstop. The backstop is that if another solution cannot be found, involving prancing unicorns or whatever it will actually involve, then Northern Ireland remains within essentially the single market and customs union.
I'm so glad Alan cleared all of that.
There you go.
I'll take the gentleman at the back and then I'll come to yourself. Yep, you.
Just I've been reading into this obviously for the last couple of years, read the full document that they just released. Something on the first page I find quite concerning. It says the withdrawal agreement for the EU and atomic energy agreements.
Yeah.
Are there other hidden organisations which they're now putting under the guise of the EU and going to kick us out of, like ESA, various medical side of it? Okay, we know
You've read
the
it,
EU
you
is...
tell us.
I don't get party to the meetings, unfortunately, and it seems to be that, okay, some people, a small 30% of England pretty much wanted to leave the EU, but we're getting the EU and this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this is 2 years in, and did anyone else know we were leaving the atomic energy agreements?
Yes.
None of us did, and it's the title of the document. I'm just curious what your thoughts are, and if you possibly are getting some kind of more info than us, or are you being left out kind of in the cold as well?
Sure.
I'm aware that there was a court case fairly recently to try and revoke Article 50. I don't know if you've got an update on that with the ECJ and whether or not that might potentially be our saviour.
And John.
I was wanting to ask you, Alan, you see them, just what you described there, UK going back with all the different agreements. They're supposed to pay a vast amount of money. They're making all these agreements. You see their future relationship. What can the EU do to hold them accountable for their agreements? What kind of powers would they have? What would they be able to use to get the money or to force them to stand by their agreements?
Nice easy questions, eh? Thanks. The first one about Euratom, absolutely. This wasn't news to any of us in Brussels. This has been part of the discussion for a while. But this is what the problem with no prospectus is. Right the way back to the get-go, it was, you can have the benefits of the club while leaving the club. Now that's intellectually dishonest, but that was the premise. And people voted leave without a unified understanding of what they were actually voting for. Some people voted leave for this, some people voted leave for that, some people voted leave for the other. And the campaign, which was quite deliberate in it, it was, everything you want. And then it was up to somebody else to deliver. Now, what Mrs May did And remember, the question was, do you want to remain or leave the European Union? There was no mention of single market, there was no mention of customs union, there was no mention of Euratom, there was no mention of the European Space Agency, there was no mention of anything else. Indeed, one of the leading Brexiters, Daniel Hannan, a Tory MEP, with the generations of public skill confidence, nobody's talking about leaving the single market. And then within a couple of months it was, well, of course we were leaving the single market. He couldn't mark them with a pick shaft. There's been such intellectual dishonesty throughout this. But because Mrs May tied her hands in her Lancaster House speech, it was, if you want to be part of the single market, you need to accept the 4 freedoms, which is the free movement of capital, labour being the big one, free movement of people. So if you're not willing to accept free movement of people, that means you can't be in the single market. So Norway's out, Iceland's out. If you're not willing to accept the customs union, you limit your options even further. And where the Tories are talking about unelected foreign judges in the European Court of Justice jurisdiction, that means you're not able to be part of the EU agencies, including Euratom.
So it's all the EU agencies?
Well, that's going to be dealt with in the next phase of the talks, but the starting position is, unless you accept the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice in your dealings with whatever it might be, then you can't be a member. Now, the EU side is saying, we would love you to be a member, but you're not going to do that under a special package just for yourself. Yeah, we're a bowls club, you can't play tennis, sorry. That's the reality of it. And the UK is saying, well, we want to still be a member of the bowls club, but we're going to play tennis, eh? And it's just not serious. So in terms of how the EU agencies do business, they are governed by the European Parliament as the budgetary authority, and the European Court of Justice ultimately as the legal authority, the guarantor of the constitutional order. And if the UK is not willing to accept that jurisdiction, then that means the UK cannot be a part of it. So the UK is going to need to negotiate some sort of satellite relationship on every single thing.
Can I ask one little tack on? Are the UK
No, I'm going to move on. I'll come back to you. I've got lots of people to try and get in. I've also got questions from Facebook as well. I will come back to you, I promise, don't worry. But I want to get to the court case.
Yep.
And if there's an update on that, because somebody else has come in from Facebook to ask about that as well. Sorry to cut you off, but I just want to get as many folk in as possible.
Yep. The Article 50 court case, now there's a couple of Article 50 court cases. There's one court case which I am not associated with, and I hide my doubts about, I have to say, that says that Article 50 was not properly triggered. I don't think that's serious. I think they're well intentioned, but I don't think that's got legs. The case that I'm part of, and there's a number of Scottish politicians, it's Andy Whiteman and Ross Greer for the Greens, David Martin and Catherine Styler for Labour, myself and Joanna Cherry for us, have put the badges to one side and said, let's take the UK government to court to settle this question. Now the question, forgive me, it gets really technical. It's about the unilateral or otherwise revocability of Article 50. Now Article 50 is a short piece of legislation. Sadly, it should be a lot more detailed. But under Article 50, it is up to the member state who wants to exit to trigger Article 50. So that triggers a 2-year process, which, if there is not agreement at the end of it, the treaties cease to apply. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. If the member state wanted to revoke Article 50, can that be done unilaterally, just by the member state? Or does that need to be done by agreement with the other member states? Now, I see heads nodding, I think you've got the point. If the UK can say, even after 2 years of heartbreak, we're pulling it back, what's the EU's reaction to that? Do they have a legal power to say, no, you can't?
Does it not say if all states agree, then you can postpone it?
No, forgive me. On postponement, yes. And this is where the case is based. The Article 50 2-year period can be extended on application by the exiting member state by agreement of the other member states. So that the Article 50 timeframe could be extended. But on the revocation of Article 50 altogether, there is nothing in Article 50 or any of the other treaties that says how that works. So is it that there could be a meaningful vote in the House of Commons that instructs the Prime Minister to revoke Article 50? In which case, how do our European partners and friends look at that? And is that a unilateral power on the part of the UK or does it need to be done by agreement with the other member states, in which case what are the conditions? So we've taken the case in the teeth of opposition from the UK government. We took it to the Court of Session in Edinburgh, we lost. We appealed it in the Court of Session, we won. The Court of Session made the reference to the European Court of Justice. We're going to Luxembourg on the 27th of November for our hearing, but the UK government still is trying to stop us doing it. They appealed the Inner House Court of Session judgment to the UK Supreme Court, I think in breach of the Treaty of Union 1707. Yeah, we're getting into really good stuff now. But there is also going to be a decision of the UK Supreme Court, probably literally a couple of days before the hearing in Luxembourg, as to whether or not the Court of Session could have or should have made that referral.
Are they just doing it to delay it then?
They're trying.
Just trying to delay
They're
it so
trying.
Past Brexit?
Yeah. And the UK government submission was signed by 5 QCs.
Right.
They have thrown vast amounts of public money at trying to shut this down. Because it's a material difference. If Stuart, when a vote comes before the House of Commons, knows that the House of Commons can revoke this and it stops, it's a very different scenario to we can't revoke it. So what we should, all things being equal, we should get a ruling from the Court of Justice in Luxembourg round about early December, which will be an absolutely incontrovertible black and white, here's how you do that.
Which will be just before Parliament's asked to vote on this.
There we go.
And so it'll happen quite quickly, actually, all of these things. And on the question of whether Parliament can instruct the Prime Minister to revoke it, myself and Joanna asked that question in the most basic, easily understood way of the Prime Minister, only for her to say, the people of Britain voted to leave the European Union and we will leave the European Union. But what that means is they are evidently unsure and deeply uncomfortable about folk poking around this question, never mind taking it to the European Court of Justice. Now, there was another one to come in on there as well. I don't know if you picked from John.
John on the finances. Right. We want the financial provisions to be stuck to. Because the EU is not just about we put money in, it's also about we get money back. So this money comes back to our farmers, to our universities, to our fishermen, to all sorts of sectors. I mean, there's thousands of modern apprenticeships in this city being paid for by European Social Fund money. So when the Tories are talking about we give all this money to the EU, well, aye, but then it comes back. So we want the financial provisions to continue, and the financial provisions are we're settling our debts. What sort of country doesn't settle its debts? And we want that to continue to the very end of the period so that organisations within Scotland can still bid for and get EU funding. Because once that funding stops, we can only go to the UK Exchequer and the Chancellor.
Good luck with that.
And that's where I think there's going to be a lot of significant changes to a lot of organisations. I'm involved with a number of charities in Scotland using European Social Fund money. And the fact is, if the European Social Fund money isn't there, is it going to be replaced by something from the UK? No, it could be. Let's be fair, it could be. But it'll be at the behest of the UK Chancellor. And that's a different set of frameworks, a different set of priorities to what we're dealing with right now. So we want the financial provisions to continue. We absolutely want that because there's a lot of organisations in Scotland that are dependent upon it.
A question has come in from Facebook from Raymond Sim. What's happening regarding fisheries? Are our waters going to be used as a bargaining tool?
Absolutely everything is being used as a bargaining tool. The UK government is negotiating with everything they've got, and indeed lots of things that we've got. That's the reality of it. The fisheries question, and it's to an SNP audience especially, we can look the fishermen of Scotland in the eye, the fishing people of Scotland in the eye and say, we are out there fighting for you. And remember, every single constituency in Scotland voted Remain, including the North East, including Shetland. In the EU referendum, I spent 2 days in Shetland quite specifically to go and talk fish. And I was expecting to need a Kevlar vest. And absolutely. Now, I'm not saying that many of the fishing folk were humming Ode to Joy while they were voting, but there was a recognition that the Common Fisheries Policy is delivering. The pain that we had of the fish stocks being in trouble a number of years ago, that's gone. a lot of the fishing folk are getting good numbers right now. The industry's doing well. Now remember, the fishing sector in Scotland is not just about boats going to sea and catching fish. It's about aquaculture, fish farming, salmon, shellfish. It's about the processing. You're actually taking the fisheries products and turning it into product. It's also about selling our fish. And we produce an awful lot more fisheries products than we consume. So access to the single market, by and large, to Spain, is existential for the processing and the aquaculture sectors. And they employ far more people. For every one job at sea, there's 7 on shore. They employ far more people. And if we do not have tariff-free, frictionless access into the EU single market, where are we going to sell this stuff? So it's not that this will somehow continue, it's that it'll stop. So where the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, which is very good with the media, and it's quite legitimate that they represent their interests, they are representing part of one bit of the fisheries sector. They are not the voice of the fishing industry. And in terms of the quota and the catch, there is some potential for renegotiation. There's also, let's be clear, a massive concentration of who owns the quota in Scotland. By and large, it's 5 families. So we're not talking about para handy with a wee couple of buddies out in a boat. We're talking about big business, which is running fisheries in Scotland. So in terms of the advantages to them, well, that needs to be looked at on its merits. We are working hard to make sure that we get the best deal for fisheries. But the EU side, and this is where it's brass tacks, realpolitik, folks. If we don't get access to the single market, existential for the shellfish processing and aquaculture sectors, and the big boats, if they can't land into Scotland because that's not part of the customs union single market, they'll land into the continental ports. So that means the fish won't even come here. So for the sake of the economic interests of a few economic actors of one bit of one sector of one industry, our jobs, we're the National Party of Scotland. We're looking after the national interest. So the idea that the Scottish Tories have become a wholly owned subsidiary of one bit of one sector of one industry is a poor show. They are not looking after the interests of fisheries. Now we want a good deal for our catching sector, absolutely, and we're working hard to get it. And there are potentially ways that we can do that. But the North Sea is a mixed fishery. By and large, the juvenile fish are in southern waters, often Danish or Dutch, and then they come north as they mature. So if there isn't access to our waters of other vessels, they'll just catch the juvenile fish in theirs. So then we'll get fewer fish. So this is a hugely complicated, interconnected business. And the way that Norway does things is what I believe the SFF is looking for, and that for the catching sector could be a better result. That's work in progress, but be in no doubt you can't have your cake once you've eaten it. And that's what some of the demands actually are from some of the fisheries sectors.
Okay, just catch me again. I'll come to Margaret, and then I'll come back to you, and then I'll come to yourself. Margaret.
Colin and I were in the northeast for a short break about 18 months ago, and we were shown around Fraserburgh and Peterhead. All the processing companies had closed down because Sainsbury's and Marks and Spencer's insisted on them being processed in Grimsby. The Safeway advert says where they get all their food, and we get our fish fresh from Grimsby, but they're not being processed in Scotland, and I'd like to see that dealt with. These jobs have been lost to us.
Sure. Yep.
Can I just correct something you said a few minutes ago? You said money comes back from the EU into Scotland. And you specifically said Scottish farmers, which of course we all know is not true. It was £160 million was supposed to come to Scottish farmers, never quite made it north of the border. It gets stuck somewhere. But my question is, I have a fear that at 11:01, on the 29th of March next year, the Tory government in London is going to introduce emergency legislation which will shut down all the devolved parliaments. I really do fear that, because there'll be nobody there to stop them. And what I want to know is, how do we prevent that? We must view that as a potentially real situation.
And yourself.
Thank you. I just wonder if when the withdrawal agreement comes to a vote in Westminster and it's rejected. Where do you see that going? Because as much as you say, oh, the no deal outcome is highly undesirable and you don't think likely, what changes might be possible given that there's also Tory hardliners such as Andrea Leadsom and David Davis wanting to do things like they take away the single market customs union for Northern Ireland, for example.
Sure. Okay, Alan?
Yep, on Margaret's point about job losses in the north, absolutely. I was there recently and was shocked at the extent to which things have been done. But in terms of how Tesco does its business, that's for Tesco. And I've been on the Agriculture Committee for a number of years, and the EU rules were blamed for you weren't allowed to sell wonky fruit, etc. Well, it wasn't allowed to be sold because the supermarkets didn't want to sell it, because the consumers didn't want it. It's easier to blame the EU rules. And it's not like the stuff was going to waste, it was going into jams or pies or whatever else. There was no food wasted. But because this perception was allowed to build up that, oh, the EU rules make life really difficult, actually it's the chronically badly structured market for food within the UK that puts far too much power in the hands of far too few big multiples. And no European country structures its food market the way the UK does. Not one. It's all much smaller operators, much more local supply chains, much shorter supply chains. You look at the supply chains for a lasagna, the different bits of the lasagna have come hundreds of miles in terms of the processing, and on any objective marker that's just not efficient. But because of the screwy economics that the UK is working to, it is perceived as efficient. So in terms of the economic power of the process, the retailers to dictate how the processing sector works, I think that is unhealthy. But it's not a result of anything to do with the EU. So that's why we need a supermarket regulator with teeth and legal powers. Where at the moment we've got Christine Tayson, who's a fine woman, but she's working 3 days a week with very limited powers. And we need somebody who can actually be an ombudsperson to really get into this. You're quite right, the budget that was supposed to come to Scottish farmers, to explain it, because I'd dented my head against this brick wall for years. The UK was allocated an additional £160 million specifically because Scottish farmers got such a bad deal. The UK minister, the money then came to DEFRA in London, specifically because of Scotland's bad deal, because our area of payments got the rule that you're not allowed to have payments less than 2/3 of the EU average. So there was a balancing payment. And everybody but everybody expected that this money would come to Scottish farmers. So that was what it was being sent for. The Tories in the Scottish Parliament, to their credit, thought that that was what was going to happen. The former presiding officer, Alex Ferguson, he was very vocal in this. He was saying, well, of course this is Scotland's farmers' money. SNP, Lib Dems, Greens, everybody signed up to the joint letter that, well, of course this is coming. And then the UK minister decided instead to allocate it across the UK, basically on the Barnett formula. Because the UK minister looked at it and said, well, I've got a slug of cash to go to farmers, I don't care which farmers. So you're right, there's how the UK apparatus will deal with this. Your question about shutting down devolution, it's an extreme scenario, but look at what's being done. We are operating against a group of people, and it's the people around the Conservatives I'm worried about. It's the dark money, the AstroTurf organisations. My Green colleague Molly Scott-Cato has been fantastic in terms of it. If you Google it, it's 55 Tufton Street, where a number of these organisations, the Taxpayers Alliance, the AstroTurf organisations that are just given absolute, here's somebody from this on the BBC and the rest, as if they were somehow impartial or credible. And no, they're not. And there are a number of people in that sort of bracket who will look to use this crisis as and that's why we need to cut all this red tape. They always talk about red tape. The reason why we don't send kids up chimneys anymore is because we regulate business. That's not red tape. The reason why we have more energy efficient cars is because we regulate them. That's not red tape. But if people coming from that agenda are saying, in order to promote our competitiveness, because we're having an economic crisis, which we caused, we're going to need to do this, then I fear that there is an agenda out there. And in terms of the position of Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, the people who are pushing Brexit hardest have no affection for devolution. And this is where it's a challenge to people who were former no voters but were very massively pro-devolution. Devolution is under assault. The powers of the Scottish Parliament, the budget of the Scottish Parliament, and indeed Scotland's democracy have been comprehensively disrespected throughout this process.
This was actually, a lot of people forget this in the drama of it, but this was why we walked out of Westminster that day. It was on the back of that week we had the debate on the devolution elements of the bill, in which no MP from a devolved part of the UK was afforded the opportunity to speak. In fact, it was, if we call it a debate, it wasn't a debate. It was a 15-minute speech, and then we move on, is what it was. So Alan's right, it's absolutely under assault. Your scenario you put forward is the extreme end of that, but you know, anything is possible these days, and it's important that those who value devolution fight for it. And I think what the Tories forget is sometimes there just isn't a big enough constituency in Scotland now. That kind of anti-independence and anti-devolution constituency just it can't deliver anything for them. Now, in terms of what happens next, if so this comes to the vote in December and it gets voted down. What happens next? Well, it's kind of anybody's guess at this stage. There is a bit of a fight going on at the minute between Parliament and the government over whether or not Parliament will have a role in amending any motion that the government brings forward. The government are desperate to make sure that Parliament can't do that, which would be, in my view, highly unusual, that Parliament can't seek to amend a government motion. And I think we're set to hear from the Procedure Committee pretty soon on whether or not that will happen. The battle really is to get a motion that the opposition can get behind. And I say to Labour colleagues at this point, get your act together. This is serious stuff, because is the government united? No, but neither is the opposition. I would say this wouldn't tie, but it's absolutely true to say that we are the only party that has put forward a consistent set of proposals and compromises, whilst the others have torn themselves up to varying degrees. So there's quite a lot to happen between now and the vote itself. I haven't even thought beyond the vote itself at this stage, to be honest. But if this is voted down, how's it going to go down in Europe, in your view?
Yeah, badly, but better than what might otherwise be the case. There is a strong desire on the part of EU27 to have an orderly process, to have an orderly exit, to go through the gears, to manage this. My point that I'm making, I've been doing quite a lot in the Brussels media to put colleagues on notice that, look, you think this is going to be an orderly process, it isn't. It's going to collapse, because that agreement isn't fit for purpose, and there's lots of people around the Conservative Party who don't want to respect that agreement. They're already doing this, as John says, why are we sending all this money to Brussels? Because it's a legal obligation, you've just signed up to it. But in the same way as they then played the victim over the Northern Ireland backstop to that thing that they agreed to, I think there are forces around the Conservative administration that want to trash the exit agreement as soon as it's done. Which means that the process collapses midway through the transition, midway through the negotiations about the future agreement. So this is not going to have any sort of certainty. It shouldn't be presented as such, because I don't think it is. So I'm going to colleagues and various others over the water, and there is a strong desire, as I say, we want to get this done. We want a signed document, and then we'll deal with you as a third country. My point being that, look, I'm sorry, but you're not going to stop doing Brexit on the 29th of March. We're going to be doing Brexit for the foreseeable future. And we can do Brexit as a managed process where we're part of the 28, or we can do it from outside, where the MEPs won't exist anymore, the UK officials within the institutions won't exist anymore. We'll all lose that expertise, that insight, that connection. And if everything's being done in a palace by the Thames, I think the discussion will go badly. At a point when millions of people are feeling anxious for their place in our communities, and millions of Brits abroad are feeling anxious as well. So in terms of no deal versus a bad deal, if this is rejected, we keep talking. That's the reality of it, because better solutions can be found. Now, I'm talking about the extension of the Article 50 period, not the extension of the transition period, but the extension of the Article 50 period, which keeps us in, because that allows us to actually go down the corridor and knock on people's door. Once we're out, we don't have that, and we lose that access. And ask a Norwegian how that works. So in terms of making sure that we find a sustainable solution, now maybe it's an EU referendum, maybe it's a meaningful vote in the House of Commons, who knows, let's not tie our hands, let's not rule anything out. But anything that keeps us in necessitates an extension of the Article 50 period. So it's a false choice to say that it's this or it's chaos. It's this or it's keep talking.
What's the old, who was a former Norwegian Prime Minister used to refer to the fax democracy, where whatever they were trying to do, they'd wait for the Europeans to fax them the rules and then they'd get on with it, having had no say in the development of the rules. Okay, we don't have much time, but I'll take another quick round, so if you want to ask something, preferably somebody who hasn't asked anything yet, try and grab my attention, but I'll start with Maura.
Thank you. Alan, in the light of what you said, and it really sounds like chaos almost which way we turn, and you've also mentioned another EU referendum. Now, there have been polls very recently showing that a substantial number of the population have changed their opinion, mainly in England and Scotland, we were always quite sensible, but from the Leave, the Brexit, the dog's Brexit, to Remain. How do you think we should be thinking about going for another referendum? I hate using the expression a people's vote. Every vote's a people's vote.
That's my favourite line.
And yourself.
Alan, you mentioned in your opening remarks you saw this whole sorriness speeding up the route to independence. How do you see that panning out?
I did say we didn't have long.
Close the doors!
Yes.
Thank you. I'm very taken by your comment about the total cost of leaving the club. I was just thinking from the standpoint of us as activists, what would be really useful would be to have a sort of rolling build-up of what that actually means in totality, because I'm sure it's huge. I'm sure it's not something you can sit down and write in the back of a fag packet, but over the piece, building it up and getting different views from different folk, educationalists, fishing specialists, atomic energy players, etc. You're just beginning to build up that huge bill of material so we can actually start to present that, because what we're dealing with here is we had an unknown quantity in terms of Brexit back in 2016, a distorted and perverted and badly sold proposition about Remain, and now we've got known quantities. It'd be really good if our quantity on what we're going to lose became an even more of a known quantity.
And can I just say before Alan answers those questions, I will not have it pass that Jim has referred to himself only as an activist. He is an SNP legend, former minister in the first ever SNP government as well. Who, I wasn't going to let you just slide in the back quietly there, Jim. But Alan, I'll let you kick the ball.
Yeah, Maura's point on polls is really important, and your point about a people's vote is absolutely the case. I've said repeatedly, anything that gives the impression of disrespecting democracy is going to invite a slap. Yeah. And I think even calling that a people's vote was star-crossed. Now, who voted in the last one? Badgers.
Probably.
Took time off from the tuberculosis treatment to go. But from our perspective, remember, I'm a Nat. Anything that undermines popular sovereignty is something we will be really careful about. And one of the most toxic things that I think the Leave campaign can throw at the EU is, you don't like democracy. You made Ireland vote again, you made France vote again in the Nice Treaty, you made the Danes vote again in the Maastricht Treaty. You don't like democracy. Now, of course, that's not the reality. All of those treaties were rejected in referendums, and then they were renegotiated. And if you go and look at them, there's an Irish protocol, and then there's a Danish protocol, and then there's the rest of it, and that won't apply in Denmark. So then it was the reformed renegotiated treaty that was put to another vote, a new vote, and approved. So, but that is something that they would throw at us. Now, our party's position on the idea of a second EU referendum is that if it becomes a thing, our guys will support it. But there's questions that need to be answered by the campaign. Pretty basic bloody question. Sorry, pretty basic question. Is the proposition going to be the deal or no deal? Or is it the deal versus Remain? Or is it the deal versus no deal versus Remain? Now, there isn't actually an answer to that yet. Now, for some legitimate reasons, but we've not given a blank check to this campaign. We've said that if this is the way out, we want to stop Brexit. But there are a number of things that need to be worked out about that yet, and we're working with them to help that process. But also in terms of where the polls are, I think the polls could go 20 points in any direction overnight at the moment. Because for an awful lot of people, back to Jim's point, an awful lot of people, Brexit isn't real yet. It's white noise, it's a dark cloud, but in terms of what it actually means to me in my life, it's not apparent yet, because it's still hypothetical, because it hasn't happened yet. So in terms of, there has been movement in the polls, the biggest shift's been in Wales, actually. Wales has gone from pretty much just Leave to pretty much just Remain. We're also seeing Plaid's leader Adam Price taking real leadership, saying there's no good news in Brexit for Wales, we're against it. And it's that sort of thing that's going to change the debate. And we may well get to another EU referendum. But in order to properly promulgate that through Westminster, to properly set the question, to properly decide what the premise is, that's going to take time. That's going to take time that will take us beyond March next year. So we're going to need to extend Article 50, which is back to the court case about can we do that unilaterally, or do we need to have the agreement of the EU 27 to do that, in which case, what are the conditions of that?
And would there not be other European elections by then as well? So
there's the issue of the European elections, which I'll declare an interest, but the dynamic amongst the MEPs, I'll speak frankly, the dynamic amongst the MEPs has changed since the UK seats were provisionally reallocated across the other member states. Now, provisionally, in the event Brexit happens, Ireland gets 2 more seats, Germany gets 3 more seats, whatever it is. And politicians being politicians, with an election coming up, Ireland having 2 more seats means that that's more likely to happen, or that's more likely to happen. It's being factored into the electoral calculus of the member states, and the election's only in May. So the dynamic amongst some of the MEP colleagues has shifted a bit. It's still, oh well, we do want to reverse this, but if those seats would be really handy for getting me re-elected.
Any truth in the rumour that Nigel Farage is changing his name to Nigel O'Farage?
Well, he's made sure his kids will get German passports, as he's fully entitled to do, but there's where they're coming from. So there is scope for a second referendum. There's a number of things to be worked out about that yet. So we're not going to tie our hands on it, but if it's a way out, let's look at it on its merits.
Thanks, Sam.
On the route to independence, I'm not sure I said it speeds up the route to independence. I think I said it would alter how that works. I think the people of Scotland are seeing in black and white, literally, in that document, what the union's delivering for us. I think a number of people in 2014, and geez, we all flogged our guts out during that campaign. And I didn't get a lot of hostility, and I was campaigning in Morningside and Newington and Deuce suburbs of Edinburgh. And there wasn't a lot of hostility, but there were people who just weren't persuaded. And they weren't persuaded on the basis that, well, that's more or less working. Life's all right. We've got our parliament here. We've got the best of both worlds. And these are the people who have been appalled by the last couple of years. And they've been appalled at the assault on Scotland's Parliament's powers. They've been appalled at the way that Scotland has been treated, and this is where we need to, as Nats, those of us who are Nats in this room, be really careful about how we engage with other people's politics. I think it is to the immense credit of the Scottish Labour Party that they have signed up to all the cross-party agreements in Holyrood to defend devolution. David Martin MEP, Catherine Styler MEP, Labour MEPs have been hand in glove with us. David serves with me on the First Minister's Standing Council in Europe, and he volunteered for this. The Labour Party, people from the Labour Party who are massively pro-devolution but a bit sceptical about independence, we need to keep them coming. Yes. And I think there's a number of people who are on a journey at the moment in Scotland. And I think, and we have to, it's the right thing to do, but it's also smart politics. We need to work through the gears on opposing Brexit in every possible way we can. But if it then gets to the point that we can't save England from itself, I think it's legitimate to try and save ourselves. Now, we need to go through absolutely every gear that we can to get to that. But what if we can't fix it? Should we just go down with the ship? And I think there's a lot of people in Scotland who are looking at this, and a lot of people haven't made up their minds yet. But I don't think people's attitudes to the Constitution is remotely fixed at the moment. I think a lot of people are looking for a home. So we need to be serious at our posts. We need to be the grown-ups. And we need to do all we can to protect Scotland, protect devolution, and do what we can to make the lives of the people of Scotland as happy as we can. Now, on Jim's point, absolutely, and Jim made their order of merit first class. Jim also came up with my favourite phrase for the SNP, and I forget which meeting it was, and he said, the SNP is a team game. I win, you win, I win, we all share in each other's success. Which I plagiarise a lot because it is my favourite attitude to how the SNP works. We're all doing our bit, and we're all part of a team. And we all share the information across the team, and we all support each other. At the point about what we're going to lose, this has been keeping me awake at night, because unless Brexit becomes real to people, they're not going to shift where they are. They don't like it, but they're defaulting to either just get on with it or just make it go away. One of the others. But as we see what people line by line are going to lose, I've got a meeting in Edinburgh next week with a gathering of cultural organisations. Culture is hugely important to Scotland. It's hugely important about who we are. They're worried about visas for artists coming to Scotland. They're worried about funding that's coming from the EU via the cultural networks to local government to assist with local arts projects. Now, will that be made up by domestic UK resource? Maybe. I hear my dudes. Pet passports. Now, there's not many people in Scotland who have pet passports because of our geography. By and large, you don't take tiddles on your holiday. But in the southeast of England, it's round about 8 in 10. It sounds like the game show. It's 8 out of 10 cats actually do have a pet passport, because people will take their dogs on holiday with them. They will take their cats on holiday with them because it's easier. Now, those pet passports will not be valid anymore. So the amount of emails I've had about pet passports, all the issues. Never mind macroeconomic stability or peace in Europe. I can't get tiddles over to Cali. But as people realise what they're going to lose, or what they might lose, I think that will shift a lot of people in our direction. My frustration so far has been that the Brexiters can say, we'll make that up. The cultural fund, of course we'll make that up. The single farm payment, of course we'll duplicate that system. But that fudge won't last much longer. So line by line, will we still be part of the Erasmus programme and send students and apprentices over to other European? Of course we will. And the attitude from the EU on all of this stuff is, of course you can, it'll cost you. Because like Norway does, Norway opts into all of the EU programmes, and they pay for every single one. So instead of paying the entry ticket and then getting all the benefits, there's an itemised bill for absolutely everything. And we're on that. That's exactly what I'm looking to do. My trouble at the moment is they've got out a get out of jail free card that says, we'll keep that going. Or the really weasel words, it's our intention to keep that going. And that's not going to last for much longer.
Okay, I should point out, Alan, you are an honorary vet.
I am. I actually am.
So I'm not surprised they're writing to you about pet.
To explain that, Because of my work in the Agriculture Committee, I did an awful lot with animal welfare. And the British Veterinary Association, and I'm also Honorary Vice President of the SSPCA, which is really close to my heart.
I thought you said the SSP.
No, that would be a revelation, but the SSPCA, great bunch of folks. But I was also made an honorary vet, so if you've got any honorary animals with an honorary complaint, do let me know.
Okay, we've got about 8 or 9 minutes left, so I'm going to take the last round of questions, and we'll start with yourself.
Mine will be a quick one.
Okay, and I'll come to Colin as well, but I'll start with you.
Following up on the question of when we have an independence vote, in Scotland that is, I find it very worrying the way that things are going, you know, all to do with the whole process of negotiation. You know, I fear that when we have our vote, that the whole thing about negotiation will be dragged out so long, everything will be put to, you know, the, what's the word, you know, it will be looked at, excuse me, so carefully, and at the end of it all, they will then say, well, we have to take this not only back to the Scottish Parliament, but possibly even to the other Westminster Parliament. I find all these things are getting more and more worrying, because they are definitely going to use every single thing that's gone on during this particular vote and this particular negotiation. They're going to use it against us, and we're going to have to be very, very, very clever to get through this.
Okay.
Mine kind of links into that, and it's a bit of a hypothetical question. If there is a general election in the short term, would SNP, so it is really more for Stuart, would the
I'm up against you on that, that should be fine.
Would the SNP ever consider forming a government with Labour, particularly keeping in mind that Richard Leonard has said that they would put it in their UK-wide manifesto not to allow an independence?
Colin, something easier than that.
Supposing Brexit went ahead, I'm looking to sometime, hopefully not too distant future, Scotland voted for independence. Would it make our attempts to enter the EU more difficult?
Okay, so we have another independence referendum, we vote yes. I mean, I guess in essence, what can we learn from this negotiation and this referendum for a future independence referendum? What do you think?
Well, you're absolutely right, which is where Maura's point about our attitudes to the people's vote have been. Our starting point was we value sovereignty. We believe in the sovereignty of the people of Scotland, and we don't want to do anything that undermines that, or could be taken as a precedent to undermine it. Yeah, the idea that you can have a vote and then you do it again. Yeah, no to that, no danger. But this is where we'll view the campaign for a second EU referendum on its merits, and I suspect it won't be the same question again. It'll be this deal or remain. So it will be a different proposition. Also, that Article 50 is not about independence, it's about leaving the EU. So it's a specific body of law that is sui generis, it's unique. International law and practice on independence is 50% plus 1, no comebacks. Now, it's open within the UK's constitutional order to decide how we want to do that, but our starting point is the people of Scotland are sovereign. Now, obviously, we want that to be a negotiated, agreed constitutional process with the UK government. We will never do what the Catalans did and have a referendum that was not sanctioned, because it didn't work. And I don't think the people of Scotland would be with us if we did, because we're serious. We also have an entirely different claim, given that Scotland's relationship with the UK is itself based on an international treaty. So there's a very distinct set of circumstances that, but you're right in terms of things that could be pretended to be precedents right now. The idea that, well, you have your vote and then you have your negotiation, then you have another vote. I said, no, that will not be the proposition.